people joining, but I'll get started. Hi, everybody. I am Ben Wetzler. I'm the Senior Research Manager here at Open New York. If you are not familiar with Open New York, we are a pro-housing advocacy organization in New York City. We aim to make the city more, New York State, all over. But today I'm specifically going to be talking about New York City. Aim to make the city more affordable and accessible by expanding the supply of homes. And we're going to be talking about Coge, the Commission on Government Efficiency, which put out its report a little while ago with some ballot propositions that are going to be on the November election ballot here in New York City. So these are a couple changes to the city charter. There are 5 of them. I'm specifically going to be talking about numbers 3 and 4, because those are the ones that directly affect the work of Open New York, of making more housing in New York City. But I'll talk a little bit about kind of the process, and I'm specifically going to, I think, compare it to last year's process, because last year there was a much larger and more robust reform effort for the New York City Charter that was much more focused on the work that Open New York does. And there have been some questions from our members and from other people in the public about, how this is a little bit different. So that's the focus for today. We'll be taking questions. You can put those in the chat. Some people have already sent in questions, but I'm going to get started. First, like I said, Coge stands for Commission on Government Efficiency. It's very similar. I hate the name because it's very similar to Doge, which was the Department of Government Efficiency that existed a little bit at the federal government. These are very different efforts. That was a kind of firing spree that happened where they just purged a whole bunch of people at departments that they didn't like. This is an effort specifically with policy people from a number of different parts of city government and advocacy to recommend changes to the charter. It is a much more democratic process. It is very similar in ways to previous charter commissions in terms of the process that happened. The mayor announced that he had some changes that he wanted to make, convened, appointed people, appointed a staff, convened a number of hearings, took input from the public, and is now that commission put out a report with recommendations for changes that will go on the ballot. If those changes are adopted by the voters, they will make permanent changes to the city charter. That happened last year. Open New York and our membership were very, very different. We're very, very actively involved in that effort last year, but this is pretty different in terms of its scope and in terms of the outcome. Last year's Charter Commission process, the 2025 one, was announced in December of 2024, and then it put out its report in late July. Coge this year was only convened a little bit after Memorial Day this year, so late May, put out its report in late July. So right there from the get-go, this is just by its very nature a more limited process. It has none of the things that are going to be on the ballot this year are as ambitious as they were last year. And that's largely a structural reason. It's because, this is a more contained effort. It also has, just from the beginning, a more limited scope. The 2025 charter revision process was convened very specifically to talk about facilitating new housing, which is near and dear to my heart and the heart of all of Open New York's members, and reforming the city's elections. So there were 2 policy issues that they were intentionally going to look into and make recommendations for how the city could do better in those specific policy areas. This was focused much more on the administration of city government. So it's much broader in the sense that it covers a lot more potential topics, but also a little bit shallower in terms of there is no specific policy goal here. It was just, how can we make everything a little bit simpler, work a little bit better, reduce some of the redundancy, and speed up some of the processes that we're doing. So when you start thinking about this in terms of what's going to be on the ballot, I know that I've talked to some of our members who were a little disappointed that there wasn't a huge ambitious set of changes this year in the same way that there was last year. It's because the city was beginning this with a very different focus. So that is necessarily just going to be reflected in the policies that were recommended. Last year, we had a number of really big policies. There was fast tracking affordable housing. There was expediting the land use review process for smaller housing projects that probably didn't need to go through the same process that a giant new skyscraper or a citywide zoning change needs to go through. There was an appeals board for affordable housing projects that are unfairly blocked. This year, these are much more constrained ones. The two questions that deal with housing are specifically a change to the structure of the Department of Buildings and how they deal with inspections and permits of new apartment buildings, and a much broader question about how the city deals with the land that it owns, and only one part of that deals with, if they want to build affordable housing on city-owned land, what the process for making that decision looks like. So those are the two things that I'm really going to be talking about today, and those are kind of the two things that we're dealing with. But it's not the same like big expansive reform that would justify a big political effort, because last year there was a huge political effort. There was the Yes on Affordable Housing campaign that a lot of our members were really actively involved in. They were out volunteering, they're knocking on doors, handing out flyers, everything. This is probably going to be a more toned down effort. We're not going to, because it's not as specifically focused on the issues that we care about, and it's a little bit more constrained in terms of what we are dealing with. So let's talk a little bit, sorry, I'm checking my notes, about what Coge actually put out. And Open New York did go and testify. Our organization's executive director, Anne Marie Gray, she went and testified, and we encouraged a lot of our members to testify, specifically on ways that we think the permitting process could be made more efficient. The process by which the city makes decisions to allow a new apartment building or a new housing to be built. Our position was basically, we wanted three changes. The first was reforming the city charter to give rulemaking authority around the construction codes to the Department of Buildings. So instead of a change to the code having to be made in law, it could be made directly by the Department of Buildings in terms of how they administer things. It just makes it a little bit simpler, less politicized, to make code changes. So that was one thing that we wanted. We wanted to make a reform to the mission of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, because right now the Landmarks Preservation Commission does not, and in fact, people have argued is legally barred from considering the impact that its decisions have on housing, specifically the quantity of housing in the city. They're right now, a big problem in landmark buildings is that they kind of got renovated, and you take one that used to be like an apartment with multiple families in it, and it gets turned into a giant mansion, and the LPC says, well, it still looks the same. It's still the same historic structure. So we're going to allow that. We didn't want that. We thought that they should have to consider the impact that they're having on the city's housing policy, the city's housing stock as a whole. So we wanted that change. And then related to that, we wanted it to be easier for the city, which owns a lot of landmarked properties, to sell the development rights associated with them. We don't want them tearing down, a beautiful city-owned building like City Hall or, historic structure to build housing, but we still want the development rights associated with those buildings to eventually become housing. So making it easier to kind of move them to a different site was something that we cared about. In terms of what we got, it was sort of less ambitious than all of that, but it included a little bit of each of those. Question 3 deals with the city, with public land. It deals with lots of stuff related to public land, including like street lane assignments and bike lanes and bus lanes and other things. But it did include, because it deals with public land, it included the provision that we had asked for about disposition of air rights over landmarked city properties. So if the city owns, a landmarked office building or some other kind of important structure, and there's unused development rights associated with the zoning in that area, they can move those to another parcel, so it'll get built up a little bit bigger than it otherwise would, and they pay the city for that. So it's going to generate revenue for the city if it's adopted and allow for more housing to be built. We were really excited about that. I think that idea came from our membership, and Anne Marie was the only person who mentioned it in her testimony. So that's pretty cool. that ended up in the final report. It also, that same process covers not just landmark properties, but also like really small lots that are otherwise would not be developable, but are owned by the city, like alleyways in between buildings or things like any kind of weird piece of land where you're like, that's not big enough to build an actual building on it, but has some air rights associated with it. The city is now this provision, if question 3 was adopted, would allow a much more streamlined process for allowing the city to sell those air rights to a company or a nonprofit to build housing with them. The second question that deals with housing, question 4, reforms the structure of the Department of Buildings. And it does so in order to make it more flexible so that they can continue doing the work that they're doing in a way that's more efficient. It does not give them any new rulemaking authority, which is what we wanted. It doesn't change anything about the building code at all, which I know some people were a little bit disappointed with, but is, to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, a little bit out of scope of Coge. They were really not trying to make policy changes in that way. They were talking about just taking the existing laws and regulations and policies and administering them more efficient. So in that sense, I guess they stuck with their mission more than what we had asked for. But right now, it really does. Question 4 really is 2 changes to the Department of Buildings at the same time. The first one comes at the beginning of the process of constructing a new building, when a developer has to go in and apply for building permits. Right now, I think somebody estimated it's like 48 different kinds of permits that you need. There's many types of permits that need to go through, like fire safety, sprinklers, stairwells, all sorts of stuff. And they all come from different parts of city government and all have their own different rules and their different practices around inspections and regulations and enforcement. Question 4 would require the city to put together a single point of contact for all of those different permits, so that the process of navigating it becomes a lot easier. So that happens kind of, it's not actually changing who is making the rules or even who is enforcing the rules, but it requires them to collaborate in a way that makes it a lot easier for people on the front end, whether anyone from a giant real estate developer that has a whole bunch of lawyers and lobbyists on the payroll, to a single homeowner who is just making some renovations to their home. This is sort of a one-stop shop that the city would be creating as a result of this. So that is one kind of big major efficiency effort that doesn't really translate into legal or regulatory changes, but will make life a lot easier. It'll just make it easier for the government to do the stuff that it's already doing, and for the public to interact with that. The second change envisioned by question 4 comes at the very other end of the development permitting process for the Department of Buildings, and that's when they issue certificates of occupancy for an apartment building to say, they went through all the permits, we issued the permits, we inspected it, we looked at it, everything is good, this building is safe for human habitation. Right now, that process is done entirely on a borough by borough basis. If you think back to the history of New York City, the first laws governing like safety and sanitation in apartment buildings were passed in the late 1800s with the tenement laws. New York City was only consolidated in its current form with the 5 boroughs in 1898. So there was already all of these laws and regulations, and all the different cities and towns that eventually came together and became the 5 boroughs of New York City all had their own practices for how they enforced them. And so when the Department of Buildings was created, they had one superintendent of buildings for each borough. They still have that. Now they're called borough commissioners, but that process is still the same. And so if you make a change to your home, or if you build an apartment building or change the use of a property so that someone can live there, you have to get a certificate of occupancy. Someone has to come and walk through the property and inspect it for safety, and that's a good thing. It's, it would be terrible if they didn't do that and people were living in unsanitary conditions. And then they have to sign off on it in order to make sure that you have that. And under the current structure, it has to be the person specifically assigned to your borough. But as you can imagine, because the boroughs are different sizes and see considerably different volumes of new construction activity, that makes it really inefficient in terms of their ability to do all of their work. There's a huge mismatch in terms of where new buildings are being built and the workloads of the different people. And so there have been proposals that have been put forward to basically consolidate those into a single division that would handle those inspections much more, just modernizing the department and getting rid of this weird kind of antiquated structure that goes all the way back to when New York wasn't even a single city. So that's kind of what's going on here. That's the one that probably, and if you're thinking of this in terms of the mission of Coge to like make the city more efficient and streamline all of the stuff that it has to do, that's probably the most like concrete transformation that they're envisioning, is just getting all of these inspections done, giving the authority of the people who are running the Department of Buildings to assign inspectors in a way that they think makes the best use of the city personnel and their time, and not kind of doing it based on borough. They didn't make the change that we had asked for, which was giving them rulemaking authority. But I think that, like I said earlier, that's fine. But it does mean that this is kind of a comprehensive approach to the problem of eliminating the bureaucracy around new permits and new inspections. Like, they are, on the one hand, making it easier for new applications to come in by having a single point where all of the different permits can go into, and then they're making it more efficient on the back end or the end of the process by making it so that those inspections can be done very quickly. And we got a question that came in before I started, actually, but started talking, but about trying to quantify that. I'm a little reluctant to do that because obviously every type of permit is going to be very different and requires a different level of work by the city. But the kind of soup to nuts estimate for the the residential new building permitting process is somewhere around 4 years on average, from the first time that an application comes in to when the final certificate of occupancy is issued. And just the certificate of occupancy part, that last that like assigning the inspector and having them walk through and say, okay, you did this already, takes, around 6 months. So that's a pretty solid chunk of the process. And if they're able to to streamline that, you're talking potentially double digits percentage improvement in the number of permits that they can issue on any given, the amount of work that they're able to do towards getting everything signed off and move forward. So that's not for such a small, what you would think of as not even changing the substance of the code, just changing how they assign the inspectors. That's pretty significant. Sorry, that I seeing in the chat, there was a question for temporary or partial TOC as well. Yeah, so that's for certificate of occupancy. You can get a temporary certificate of occupancy if the inspection only shows relatively small things that need to be fixed. They're not going to completely deny it. So it's the same process, the same people doing it. So making that section of the Department of Buildings more efficient would improve both of those things. So yeah, that's it. Just makes the whole process of getting the building inspected much more efficient. So that's sort of everything I got to say on the subject. But if you want to, we got a couple questions in the chat, most of which are focused on the scope and like what is next steps, and I can talk a little bit about that. So one person asked, do we think that the proposals are modest because that this intentionally modest effort compared to last year means that there will be room for more ambition in the future? And I think absolutely yes. I think it's very clear from this effort that there is an appetite in city government to make this process work better, and that's going to involve administrative changes, which is what they're talking about right now, but it's also likely going to involve regulatory changes. And I think, I'm just speculating here a little bit, that the decision to not change, to not do what we had asked for and propose giving the Department of Buildings regulatory authority was because this is still a relatively new policy discussion that's happening in New York, and there isn't a concrete set of like new construction regulations that they would want to move forward with, and they were reluctant to ask voters to approve, creating new regulations without knowing what those regulations are. But that conversation is still very much happening, and I know that a lot of our members have been participating in it kind of through social media, and some of the people who work in this stuff professionally, and we are definitely, we at the organization are definitely doing that. So that is, I am thinking of this as the first step in terms of making New York's building code and building inspection regime more efficient. Not the last step, but that's definitely where we're going. I think that there is going to be a lot of room to build on this success going forward, and that we're going to see things like proposals around allowing more missing middle housing, reducing redundancies and inefficiencies around things like staircases and things like that. Like, I think we're going to see more concrete proposals coming about, and as those things come up and get debated and the implications of them are made clear, you're going to start seeing more people, more efforts like this to see them implemented. It's just not happening right now. Okay, I'm gonna check. We had a couple more questions that came in. Somebody asked if the CRC process was specifically chosen for this because it bypasses the council. That's maybe I don't have any special insight into that. That's not really a policy question. That's more of a political question, and can't speak to it. I will just say that some people, I think this was definitely true last year as well, where people went into the ballot, the voting booth, and looked at their ballot and saw, there were some really big things like creating an appeals board for affordable housing. And then there were some really small things like authorizing the city to digitize its official map. Like, that just seemed ridiculous that you would have to vote on something like that. And I think some people feel that way about this too. But I don't really, the charter is what it is. And it may feel a little bit silly that you have to vote on some of these things that seem like just straightforward efficiency restructuring around efficiency. But I wouldn't read any kind of political gamesmanship into it necessarily. I think that this is, they're putting this forward this way because this is what has to happen in order for it to be implemented. Okay, yeah, we got another kind of political-ish question in the chat. Is there a plan to clamp down on council members using their office to campaign against these measures? Last year, there was a very robust effort using taxpayer dollars by the city council, certain members of the city council, to encourage voters to vote no. And not being an election lawyer myself, I interpreted that as an abuse of office and potentially illegal. But that's just me. That's not any kind of official position of Open New York's or anyone else's. I don't know if there is. Because these are kind of more efficiency oriented and less shifting around power and policymaking authority. I don't know if it's going to inspire the same level of like backlash from the council or any other body of government. So I don't know if that's going to be an issue or not. We're going to have to take that as it comes. But I don't anticipate that this is going to be the same, giant political campaign where we need to mobilize members to do this. This is, I think, much more of a kind of housekeeping exercise by the mayor's office and other kind of good government groups. And Open New York is definitely a part of that. We see ourselves like in that ecosystem, but because these aren't specifically focused on housing policy in the same way that last year's was, where probably, I don't think that it's going to get that level of, everybody getting up in arms about it. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, we got some. Oh, sorry. There's another question that I forgot to answer. Which Coge initiative is the top priority in terms of unlocking housing supply? So like I said, kind of during the description, when I was walking through what the provisions do, the question 4, the building code one, is much more about getting housing projects that were already kind of going to move forward or already economical, already permitted by the existing regulations, et cetera, through that process faster. And that's important because the process itself is expensive. It ends up driving, all this bureaucracy and things and complications and difficulty do come at a cost. And so I do think that is going to end up unlocking housing in the sense that it just makes it easier for people who are like, oh, you know what, I should renovate my house, or you know what, I could build a new addition that might, a new bedroom on my property or something like that, to actually make that like happen in a way that adds to the housing supply. But in terms of taking a project that otherwise would not be allowed, like would never have happened, but is going to, would as a result of this effort happen, definitely the question 3 landmark air rights thing is much more significant. And I think that if I kind of did a bit of a back of an envelope exercise, but couldn't come up with a concrete number in terms of how much I think either of these questions are going to produce in terms of changes to the new housing that we see, but I suspect that one will be, the bulk of it will come specifically from that there are new projects that never would have happened, but will as a result of the city gaining this more expedited authority to use its property for housing. So I think that that's probably going to be the more significant of the two. I'm not seeing any more questions. If you got questions, put them in the chat now. Otherwise, we're coming up on a half hour. We had said 1 to 1:30, so anybody? Going once, going twice. Okay, cool. Well, I hope that this was informative. We are going to be sending out some stuff probably to our members to encourage that, on what we think next steps are going to be. But like I said, it is not going to be the same level of super intense campaigning that we asked people to do last year for the reasons discussed earlier. But I personally can just say I am planning on voting to support these 2 measures. I think that you probably should too. Then this is a small but important step towards making New York's government a little bit more, effective and efficient. And I think that that's a good thing. So, okay. We'll stop.